A ruthless gang of bandits descends upon what seems to be an unprotected farmstead, seeing the rancher's wife as easy prey. Their fatal mistake becomes clear when the former competition sharpshooter downs 8 men with 8 shots before they can even dismount their horses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've saved something extra special for you. The autumn winds howled across Thunder Valley Ranch as Sarah MacKenzie stood on her front porch, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The setting sun painted the vast wheat fields in shades of gold and crimson, a beautiful sight that masked the growing tension in this remote corner of the territory. Farm raids had become increasingly common since the Blackhawk Gang had moved into the region, their violence spreading like wildfire across the peaceful homesteads. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air from the latest raid, a grim reminder of the changing times. The MacKenzie Ranch stood as one of the last prosperous holdouts in the valley, its tall grain silos and well-maintained barns a testament to years of hard work. The property spread across 200 acres of prime Montana soil, with the main house sitting proudly on a gentle rise that offered clear views in all directions, a tactical advantage that hadn't been lost on Sarah when they'd first purchased. The land, with her husband Thomas away in Helena securing contracts for their winter wheat, Sarah maintained her daily routine, though her keen eyes constantly scanned the horizon. Few knew that beneath her simple farmwife's apron lay the steady hands and sharp eyes that had won her 3 state shooting championships before she'd chosen this quieter life. Inside the farmhouse, mounted above the stone fireplace, hung Sarah's prized Winchester rifle, its walnut stock polished to a soft gleam from years of careful maintenance. The weapon had been a gift from her father, who taught her to shoot before she could properly write her name. A woman needs to protect herself. In this world, he'd always said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Beside it, yellowed newspaper clippings chronicled her shooting competition victories, carefully preserved, though hidden behind a modest painting when visitors came calling. In this territory, a woman's skill with a rifle was something best kept. Quiet, a lesson Sarah's father had taught her long ago. The kitchen shelves held more than just the usual collection of preserves and dried goods. Behind certain jars, hidden from casual view, lay boxes of ammunition carefully organized by caliber. Sarah had always believed in being prepared, a habit that had served her well both in competition and in managing the ranch. The cellar beneath the house concealed an even more impressive arsenal, though none of the neighboring farmers who'd shared meals at her table would have guessed it. Sheriff James Cooper's badge had lost its luster in recent months. The aging. Lawman's inability to protect local farms from the Blackhawk Gang's raids, wearing heavily on his conscience. The once respected peace officer now spent his days making excuses at the county courthouse while honest farmers abandoned their lands, leaving behind ghost homesteads that dotted the territory like gravestones. His own tragic story was whispered about in town, how he'd once been the fastest drawer in 3 territories before a bullet to his shooting hand had left him with a tremor he tried to hide. Old Bill Henderson, who ran the general store in nearby Rivers Crossing, watched Sarah load supplies into her wagon with concern evident on his weathered face. He'd known her since she was a girl, had even attended several of her shooting competitions years ago. The store owner's mind drifted back to the last territorial championship, where he'd watched in amazement as Sarah had hit 20 moving targets in succession, a record that still stood. "Miss Sarah," he called out, his voice carrying across the dusty street, "maybe you ought to consider staying in town until Thomas returns. The Blackhawks hit the Peterson place last night, burned it clean to the ground." Sarah secured the last crate, her movements precise and controlled. The same efficiency that had made her a champion shooter showed in everything she did, from managing the ranch's books to handling the heavy work that many thought beyond a woman's capacity. "The harvest won't wait, Bill," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had always set her apart, even in her competition days. "Besides, someone needs to show these raiders that not every homestead is easy pickings." At the town saloon, 3 rough-looking strangers nursed their drinks, their eyes following Sarah as she guided her wagon out of town. The men's saddlebags were dusty from the trail, but their weapons were well maintained, marking them as something more dangerous than ordinary drifters. Wade "Rattler" Reynolds, the youngest of the Blackhawk Gang scouts, leaned close to his companions, the candlelight catching the snake tattoo that curved around his neck. "Boss'll want to know about this one. Husband's away, prime location, full granaries, looks like easy pickings." The saloon's regular patrons gave the strangers a wide berth, conversations dropping to whispers as people tried to avoid drawing. "Attention!" Jenny Miller, the owner's daughter, served their drinks with trembling hands, having seen firsthand the aftermath of the gang's recent raids. Her cousin's farm had been one of the first hit, and the family had fled east, never to return. Lucy Chen, whose family ran the town's laundry, overheard the men's conversation with growing dread. She'd seen Sarah's shooting trophies once, during a rare moment when her friend's guard was down. The display had been impressive. Golden cups and ribbons spanning 5 years of competitions, each one representing countless hours of practice and dedication. But it wasn't her place to warn these men about the quiet farmwife's deadly accuracy. Some lessons, her father always said, were best learned the hard way. As Sarah's wagon disappeared down the dusty road, more details about the Peterson raid filtered through town. Martha Peterson, still shaking from the previous night's attack, described the brutality of the Blackhawk Gang to Sheriff Cooper in his office. Her once neat dress was stained with soot, her eyes haunted by what she'd witnessed. "They're not just thieves anymore, James. They're becoming something worse. Their leader, this man they call the Crow, he enjoys the terror as much as the stealing. He made us watch as they burned our barn with our horses still inside." Cooper's hand trembled slightly as he poured another drink, his once sharp mind clouded by guilt and whiskey. The tremor in his shooting hand seemed worse today, a constant reminder of his limitations. He'd known Sarah since she was a girl, had even attended some of her shooting competitions years ago, but those days of sure justice seemed as distant as the mountains that rimmed the valley, their peaks already wearing the first dusting of winter snow. Back at Thunder Valley Ranch, Sarah went about her evening routine with practiced efficiency. She checked the livestock, securing them in the barn rather than leaving them in the pasture as usual. The horses were brought in from the far field, their stalls prepared for a potentially long night. She maintained the appearance of normal activity while making subtle preparations, moving water barrels into strategic positions, ensuring clear lines of sight from key windows, checking that every door and window moved silently on well-oiled hinges. As darkness settled over the valley, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, cleaning her favorite revolver, a Colt single-action army that Thomas had given her as a wedding present. Its ivory grips were simple but elegant, much like the life they'd built here. Through the window, she could see dust rising in the distance, riders approaching from the east, taking their time, confident in their superior numbers. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, and Sarah found herself remembering her father's words from long ago. "Patience is a shooter's best friend. Let them come to you." The newspaper clippings above the fireplace fluttered in the evening breeze, one yellowed headline barely visible in the fading light. "Mackenzie makes history, first woman to win territorial shooting championship 3 years running." Sarah smiled slightly at the memory as she checked her ammunition one final time, each bullet examined and carefully loaded. The Blackhawk Gang was about to learn what that headline really meant. In town, Lucy Chen paced nervously in her family's laundry, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet as she debated whether to send her young brother to warn Sarah about the stranger's conversation. The distant mountains had already swallowed the sun, casting long shadows across Rivers Crossing's main street. Through the window, she watched Sheriff Cooper stumble from his office to the saloon, his badge catching the last light of day. The Hatter lawman's decline had become a source of whispered conversations throughout the territory, much like the growing legend of the Blackhawk Gang's brutality. The saloon's swinging doors squeaked as Wade, Rattler Reynolds and his companions emerged, their boots heavy on the wooden boardwalk. The youngest of the three, barely 20 by the look of him, paused to check his rifle's action, the weapon gleaming with the kind of care that marked a serious gunman. "Send word to the boss," he ordered one of his companions. "Tell him we've found something worth his personal attention." Inside the saloon, Jenny Miller cleared the men's table, her hands shaking as she gathered their glasses. A folded paper had fallen from one of their coat pockets, a crude map of the territory with several farms marked in red. Thunder Valley Ranch was circled, with notes about its defenses and routines scrawled in the margins. The Peterson farm was crossed out, along with a dozen others. Jenny slipped the map into her apron pocket, knowing she should take it to the sheriff, but doubting it would make any difference. At the MacKenzie ranch, Sarah methodically prepared for the coming night. The autumn air had grown sharp with the promise of an early winter, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant homesteads. She moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking each window's line of sight, ensuring every lamp was filled with oil. The Winchester above the fireplace wasn't the only weapon she had positioned throughout the house. Each room contained at least one firearm, carefully hidden but within easy reach. In the barn, she finished securing the livestock, speaking softly to calm the nervous animals. They could sense the tension in the air, the horses particularly restless as they caught the scent of unfamiliar riders on the wind. Sarah patted her favorite mare's neck, remembering the days when she'd ridden in shooting competitions, the horse steady as a rock while she picked off targets at a full gallop. Those skills might prove useful before the night was through. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. A lone rider emerged from the gathering dusk. Michael Peterson, Martha's teenage son, his face streaked with soot and tears. Sarah helped him dismount, noting how he favored his left arm, a crude bandage visible beneath his torn sleeve. "They're coming, Mrs. MacKenzie," he gasped, still breathless from his ride. "I heard them planning. The Crow himself is leading them this time." Sarah led the boy inside, her mind already calculating angles and positions. "Tell me everything." "You heard, Michael. Every detail matters." As she tended his injured arm, Michael described what he'd witnessed during the attack on his family's farm. The Blackhawk Gang had grown more organized, more tactical in their approach. Their leader, a tall man with dead eyes, who wore a black duster covered in crow feathers, had personally overseen the raid. "He's different from other outlaws," Michael explained, wincing as Sarah cleaned his wound. "The way he moves, the way he gives orders, it's like he's done this before, somewhere else. And he kept asking about you, Mrs. MacKenzie." "Wanted to know if anyone had seen your husband leave for Helena." Sarah's hands remained steady as she tied off the bandage, but her mind raced with the implications. The Crow's interest in her specifically suggested this was more than a random raid. She had heard rumors about the gang's leader, whispers about his past as a Union cavalry officer who'd turned to brutality during the war and never looked back. In her cellar, Sarah showed Michael the hidden door that led to a narrow tunnel, an escape route Thomas had insisted on building when they'd first bought the ranch. "Follow it to the creek," she instructed, pressing a small revolver into his hands. "Lucy Chen's family will hide you until this is over." The boy protested, wanting to stay and help, but Sarah's tone brooked no argument. "Your mother needs to know you're safe, Michael. That's how you can help me most." As the boy disappeared into the tunnel, Sarah returned upstairs to make her final preparations. The sun had fully set now, leaving the valley bathed in moonlight that turned the wheat fields silver. Through her spyglass, she could see multiple dust clouds approaching from different directions. The gang was splitting up, planning to surround the ranch. A sound, tactical decision against a normal target, but one that would work to her advantage. In town, Lucy Chen had finally made a decision. She couldn't leave her friend without any warning. Taking a deep breath, she approached Sheriff Cooper in the saloon, where he sat staring into his whiskey glass. "Sheriff, those men who were here earlier, they're Blackhawk scouts. They're planning to hit the MacKenzie place tonight." Cooper's hand trembled as he reached for his glass, but something of his old fire flickered in his eyes. "Sarah MacKenzie," he muttered, more to himself than to Lucy. "I remember the first time I saw her shoot. Must have been 15 years ago at the Territorial Fair. Some city slicker was making fun of her, calling her little lady and such. She challenged him to a shooting match, put 10 bullets through the same hole at 50 paces. He stood unsteadily, reaching for his gun belt. Maybe it's time I remembered how to do my job." Jenny Miller approached their table, glancing nervously over her shoulder before producing the map she'd found. "There's more, Sheriff. Look at these markings. They're planning something bigger than just raids. The Crow wants to take control of the whole valley, starting with the strongest properties. That's why they're hitting Thunder Valley Ranch. They want to make an example." Back at the ranch, Sarah watched through her spyglass as the first group of riders took up positions near the edge of her wheat field. The moonlight gleamed off their weapons. Good rifles, not the usual assortment of worn-out carbines most bandits carried. The Crow was investing in quality arms, building a private army rather than just a gang of thieves. She moved silently through her house, checking each pre-positioned weapon one final time. The weight of her competition revolver was comforting. Against her hip, its action as smooth as the day Thomas had given it to her. From her vantage point in the upper floor, she could see more riders moving into position behind her barn. They were being careful, professional, which meant they were also predictable. Sarah smiled grimly as she recognized Wade Reynolds among the scouts, his snake tattoo visible even in the moonlight. He was positioning men exactly where she'd expected, following standard cavalry tactics. The Crow's military background was showing in their approach, but Sarah had spent years studying shooting angles and trajectories. Every position they took was one she'd already prepared for. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of more horses approaching. Through her spyglass, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the Crow himself, his black duster rippling in the breeze as he surveyed her property from a small rise. Even at this distance, she could see why people feared him. He sat his horse with the rigid posture of a career soldier, directing his men with sharp hand signals that spoke of years of command. What the Crow couldn't know was that every fence, post on the property had been carefully measured and marked, every distance calculated during long hours of preparation. Sarah had spent years turning Thunder Valley Ranch into more than just a farm. It was a shooter's paradise, with clear lines of sight and predetermined ranges in every direction. Thomas had often teased her about her obsession with angles and distances, but tonight that preparation would mean the difference between life and death. As the moon climbed higher, Sarah heard the first soft signals being passed between the hidden raiders, owl hoots and coyote calls that weren't quite natural. Enough. She checked her weapons one final time, remembering all those hours on the competition range, all the medals and trophies that now hung hidden behind that modest painting. The Blackhawk Gang was about to learn that they weren't the only ones who knew about tactical positioning and careful planning. In the distance, a single shot rang out, probably a nervous bandit spooked by a coyote. The sound echoed across the valley, sending a flock of crows wheeling up from the wheat field. Sarah watched them scatter against the stars, her father's words echoing in her memory. A good shooter knows that patience is just as important as accuracy. Let them make the first mistake. The night air had grown colder as Sarah moved silently through her darkened house. Years of competition, shooting, having taught her how to control her breathing even under pressure. From her upper window, she tracked the Blackhawk Gang's movements, counting at least 15 men spread out around her property. Their positioning confirmed what Michael Peterson had said. These weren't ordinary bandits. They moved with military precision, establishing overlapping fields of fire that would have trapped most defenders. Through her spyglass, she studied the crow as he directed his men from horseback. His black duster rippled in the moonlight, the crow feathers sewn into it creating an otherworldly silhouette. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about his bearing that nagged at Sarah's memory. The way he sat his horse, the sharp authority in his hand signals. She'd seen something similar years ago at a shooting competition in St. Louis. The memory clicked into place. Before the war, she'd competed against a cavalry officer named Colonel James Blackwood, a man known for his ruthless efficiency both on and off the shooting range. He'd disappeared after Gettysburg, his name whispered in connection with unauthorized raids and civilian casualties. The resemblance was too strong to be coincidence. In town, Sheriff Cooper struggled to mount his horse, his trembling hands betraying years of whiskey's influence. Lucy Chen and Jenny Miller watched from the shadows of the laundry, their faces tight with concern. "You can't go alone, Sheriff," Jenny insisted, holding up the map she'd found. "Look at these markings. There's at least 20 of them out there." Cooper finally managed to settle into his saddle, his badge catching the lamplight. "Sometimes," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in months, "a man has to remember who he used to be." He turned to Lucy. "Send word to the marshal's office in Helena. Tell them the Blackhawk Gang isn't just raiding anymore. They're trying to take over the whole territory." Back at Thunder Valley Ranch, Wade Reynolds crept closer to the main house, his snake tattoo seeming to writhe in the moonlight. He'd positioned his best men around the barn, ready to rush the house on the crow's signal. The absolute silence from the building made him uneasy. Most women would have lit lamps, barricaded doors, shown some sign of fear. A soft whistle caught his attention, one of his men signaling from near the wheat field. Reynolds squinted through the darkness, trying to make out what had alarmed his scout. Something wasn't right about the way the shadows moved between the farm buildings. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was screaming that they were missing something important. Inside the house, Sarah moved like a ghost from window to window, noting each bandit's position. Her competition days had taught her more than just accuracy. They'd taught her how to read terrain, how to predict where targets would appear. The gang had positioned themselves exactly where she'd expected, using the same tactical approach she'd practiced. Against countless times. The first sign that something was wrong came when 2 of Reynolds' men disappeared silently near the barn. One moment they were there, dark shapes against the weathered wood, and the next they had vanished without a sound. Reynolds felt his unease grow. He'd seen enough ambushes to recognize when a trap was being sprung, but this was different. There was no sign of movement, no indication of where the threat was coming from. Sarah's first shot, when it came, was so unexpected that at first no one realized what had happened. A single crack of her Winchester and Wade Reynolds' hat disappeared from his head, a clean hole through the crown serving as a warning. Before the echo had died away, her voice carried clearly across the yard. "The next shot goes through your skull, Mr. Reynolds. Tell your men to back away from my barn." The professional calm in her voice made Reynolds' blood run cold. This wasn't the panicked defense he'd expected from a lonely farm wife. This was something else entirely. "Who are you?" he called out, trying to locate the source of the voice while signaling his men to hold their positions. "Someone who can put a bullet through your eye at 300 yards. Sarah replied matter-of-factly. I've already disarmed 4 of your men. Check the shadows by the granary if you don't believe me." True to her word, Reynolds could make out several shapes slumped in the darkness, his men taken out so quietly that no one had noticed. The crow's voice cut through the night, sharp with command. "Reynolds, fall back. This one's different." The bay gang leader urged his horse forward, the moonlight gleaming off what Sarah now recognized as cavalry insignia sewn into his duster alongside the crow feathers. "You shoot like a professional, ma'am. Military training." "Competition circuit," Sarah answered, shifting positions silently as she spoke. "Though I suspect you know something about that, don't you, Colonel Blackwood?" Her use of his real name caused a visible reaction among his men. The crow's reputation had been built on mystery as much as violence, and here was a simple farmwife stripping away that mystery with a few words. "The St. Louis Championship, 1859, Blackwood called back, his voice carrying a new note of respect and curiosity. "I remember now. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who outshot half the army's best marksmen. They said you retired, married a rancher." The last words carried a subtle threat. "Where is your husband, Mrs. MacKenzie?" "Far enough away that he won't have to watch me kill you if you don't ride out of here right now," Sarah replied, her Winchester's barrel tracking his movement with practiced ease. She could see more of his men trying to work their way around, behind the house, but she'd prepared for that too. Suddenly, multiple small explosions rocked the darkness. Percussion charges Sarah had rigged earlier that day, designed more for noise and confusion than damage. The bangs and flashes sent horses rearing, disrupting the gang's carefully planned positions. In the chaos, 2 more of Reynolds' men dropped silently, precise shots having found their marks. "Last warning," Sarah's voice carried over the confusion. "The next series of charges isn't just noise, and I've got every approach to this house ranged and marked. Ask yourself if your men's loyalty will hold when they start dying for nothing more than one man's ambition." The crow's laugh was cold and appreciative. "You've gotten better since St. Louis, Mrs. MacKenzie, but I've got 20 men out here, and sooner or later, numbers tell." He raised his hand, preparing to signal the final assault, when a new sound cut through the night, hoofbeats approaching. Fast, from the direction of town, Sheriff Cooper rode out of the darkness, his badge gleaming, his gun hand steady for the first time in years. "Then maybe you should count again, Blackwood," he called out, drawing up alongside the house. "The marshal's office in Helena has been notified. They know who you really are now and what you're trying to build here." The crow's expression hardened as he assessed this new development. Sarah could see his mind working, calculating odds and angles, just as she had so often done on the competition range. The difference was, she'd already run these calculations hours ago. She knew exactly how many men he'd lost, exactly how many angles of attack remained open to him. "You've got 3 choices," Sarah announced, her voice carrying that same professional calm that had unnerved Reynolds earlier. "Ride out now, try your assault and lose half your men, or wait for the marshal's forces and lose everything. I've seen you shoot, Colonel. You were always good at calculating odds." The night stretched taut as a drawn bowstring as the crow considered his options. Sarah kept her Winchester trained on him, knowing that despite his show of contempt, he was seeing the situation with a tactician's eye. 4 of his men were down, others were spooked by the charges, and the unseen shooter who seemed able to strike anywhere. The element of surprise was gone, and with it his overwhelming advantage. But Sarah knew men like Blackwood. Their pride was as dangerous as their ambition. The next few moments would determine whether this night ended in retreat or bloodshed. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, remembering all those competition finals where a single shot had meant the difference between victory and defeat. But this wasn't a competition, and these targets wouldn't be made of clay or paper. The crow's decision came with the suddenness of a striking snake. "Burn it all!" he roared, wheeling his horse around. "If she's so good, let's see her shoot through. Flames!" His men responded immediately, hurling prepared torches toward the dry wheat fields and barn. The night erupted into chaos as multiple fires began to spread, their light casting wild shadows across the farmyard. Sarah had anticipated this tactic. The irrigation ditches she'd flooded earlier that day created barriers the flames couldn't easily cross, but the threat was real enough. Through her scope, she could see the Crow organizing his men into groups, using the growing fires as cover for a coordinated assault. His cavalry experience showed in how quickly he adapted his strategy, turning what seemed like a desperate act into a calculated military maneuver. "Cooper!" she called out to the sheriff, who had taken position near the house's corner. "Watch the barn approach." Her Winchester cracked twice in rapid succession, dropping 2 bandits who had tried using the smoke as cover. The shots weren't aimed to kill. Sarah was placing her bullets with surgical precision, disabling arms and legs, just as she'd done with clay targets in competition. Each shot was carefully calculated, each injury designed to reduce the gang's fighting strength while giving them a chance to retreat. The Crow's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with command. "Reynolds, take 6 men around the south side. Carter, get those charges set under the porch." His tactical mind was clearly working overtime, trying to overwhelm Sarah's defenses through sheer coordination and numbers. But Sarah had spent years practicing against multiple moving targets, and her competition experience was proving deadlier than any military training. Sheriff Cooper's revolver barked 3 times from his position, his hands steady with remembered skill. 2 of Reynolds's men fell back, cursing as they dragged their wounded companions to safety. The sheriff's presence had disrupted the Crow's carefully planned assault, forcing the gang to divide their attention. In town, Lucy Chen and Jenny Miller had mobilized the local farmers who still had the courage to fight. A group of riders was heading toward Thunder Valley Ranch, armed with whatever weapons they could find. The territory's people had finally had enough of living in fear. Sarah's next series of shots came from a different window, deliberately changing her position to keep the attackers guessing. The Crow had fallen back to a defensive position, directing his men with the precision of a chess master. "You can't watch every angle forever, Mrs. MacKenzie," he called out, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect beneath its menace. "Even the best shooter runs out of bullets eventually." "I've got enough for every man you've brought, Colonel," Sarah replied calmly, using his old rank deliberately. "And I haven't missed a shot in competition or otherwise since 1858. To emphasize her point, she put a bullet through the horn of his saddle, causing his horse to rear in panic. The shot was a demonstration of both her skill and her restraint. She could have easily killed him, but had chosen not to. The fire in the wheat field was spreading despite the irrigation ditches, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. Sarah could see Reynolds regrouping his men behind the barn, preparing for another rush. The gang's initial confidence had been shaken by her accuracy, but they still held the advantage of numbers. Cooper had worked his way closer to the house, his experience as a lawman showing in how he used cover. "Sarah!" he called out between shots. "There's movement in the root cellar." The warning came just in time. 2 of the Crow's men had found the underground entrance that Michael Peterson had used to escape earlier. Sarah's response was immediate and precise. 2 shots through the cellar's wooden doors, followed by pained yells and cursing. "Check your men, Blackwood." Sarah projected her voice with the same authority she'd once used to command shooting ranges. 4 dead, 8 wounded, and you haven't even reached the house yet. How many more are you willing to sacrifice? Her words were calculated to shake the gang's morale, reminding them that they were dying for one man's ambition. The Crow's response was to launch a coordinated assault from 3 directions at once. Men rushed forward through the smoke, using the growing fires as cover. Sarah's Winchester spoke repeatedly, each shot finding its mark with competition-level precision. But there were too many targets converging at once. One group of raiders reached the porch, setting charges against the house's foundation. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. She triggered her own carefully prepared defenses. Containers of water hidden in the walls burst outward, drenching the charges and the men setting them. In the confusion, more precise shots from different windows dropped 3 more raiders. The Crow's men fell back in disarray, their coordinated attack disrupted by Sarah's preparations. "You're not just good, you're exceptional," the Crow called, a genuine admiration in his voice. "Join us. With your skills, we could control the entire territory. Think bigger than this little farm, Sarah. I'm offering you an empire." His words carried the same persuasive power that had turned other skilled gunmen to his cause. But Sarah's response was another demonstration of her marksmanship, a shot that severed his horse's reins cleanly. "I've seen what your empire looks like, Colonel," she replied, her voice hard. "I saw what was left of the Peterson farm. Your kind of empire is built on fear and ash, and I won't be part of it." As if to emphasize her point, the sound of approaching riders echoed through the night. The townspeople Lucy had rallied, coming to stand against the terror that had plagued them for too long. The Crow's tactical mind assessed the changing situation quickly. The fires meant to trap Sarah had also removed his men's cover, leaving them exposed to her deadly accuracy. The approaching riders would soon tip the balance of numbers against him. But surrender wasn't in his nature. Instead, he signaled for his remaining men to concentrate their fire on one point, attempting to create a blind spot in Sarah's defense. What he didn't know was that Sarah had anticipated this too. Her time on the competition circuit had taught her to think several moves ahead, to prepare for every contingency. As his men focused their attack, they exposed themselves to Cooper's position near the barn. The sheriff's revolver sang out again, and again, his old skill returning in the heat of battle. The next few minutes were a symphony of gunfire and tactical movement. Sarah's shots came from multiple positions, each one precisely placed to disable rather than kill when possible. The Crow's men found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. Between her accuracy and Cooper's experience, the approaching riders added to their confusion, their hoofbeats growing louder by the minute. "Last chance, Colonel," Sarah called out, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Your men are loyal, but they're not foolish. How many more will die for your pride?" She punctuated her words with 2 more shots, disarming a pair of raiders who had tried to reach the back door. The Crow's response was cut short by the arrival of the townspeople, their weapons adding to the defense of Thunder Valley Ranch. Lucy Chen and Jenny Miller were among them, armed with their father's rifles. The territory's people had finally found their courage, inspired by one woman's stand against tyranny. The Blackhawk Gang's aura of invincibility was shattered, broken by Sarah's deadly accuracy and unwavering determination. The night had become a lesson in the difference between military precision and true mastery. The Crow's tactical training was being systematically dismantled by Sarah's deeper understanding of angles, trajectories, and human nature. Each shot she fired was a demonstration of why she had dominated the competition circuit, not just because of her accuracy, but because she could read situations and people with uncanny precision. As the townspeople took up positions around the farm, the balance of power shifted decisively. The Crow found himself facing not just one skilled shooter, but an entire community that had decided to stand its ground. His carefully planned raid had transformed into something else entirely, a moment that would be remembered as the night when the territory's people finally said enough. The arrival of the townspeople forced the Crow to reorganize his forces quickly. His military training showed in how smoothly he adapted, pulling his men back to more defensible positions while maintaining pressure on the house. The fires in the wheat field had created a hellish landscape of smoke and shadow, transforming Thunder Valley Ranch into a battlefield that seemed torn from the pages of his war memories. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest, Mrs. MacKenzie," he called out, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of admiration and menace. But these good townspeople should ask themselves if they're ready for the consequences of defying me. Ask the Petersons what happens to those who resist. The threat in his words was clear, but Sarah could hear something else beneath it, a growing uncertainty that his usual tactics of intimidation weren't working. Sarah's response came in the form of another precisely placed shot, this one splitting the crow feathers on his collar. "They already know the consequences of not resisting, Colonel," she replied, her voice steady as she shifted position again. "That's why they're here. Your kind of terror only works until people decide they've had enough." Through her scope, she could see him calculating odds again, his tactical mind working through scenarios. Lucy Chen and Jenny Miller had organized the townspeople into a rough defensive line, using the irrigation ditches for cover. Their presence had transformed the battlefield dynamics. What had started as a simple raid was becoming a decisive stand against the Blackhawk Gang's reign of terror. Sarah's accuracy had given them the courage to fight, showing them that the gang wasn't invincible. Sheriff Cooper had worked his way to a better position near the barn, his experience showing in how he directed the townspeople's fire. "Keep them pinned down," he shouted, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a legend before the bottle took hold. "Don't let them regroup." His hands were rock steady now, muscle memory replacing the tremors as he picked off 2 more raiders, trying to flank the defensive line. The Crow's next move revealed why he'd earned his reputation for tactical brilliance. Using the confusion of the larger battle, he'd secretly positioned his best men for a concentrated assault on the house's vulnerable north side. "Now!" he commanded, and 6 riders burst from cover simultaneously, each carrying charges meant to breach the wall. But Sarah hadn't won 3 territorial championships by being predictable. As the riders approached, she triggered another set of prepared defenses. Hidden ropes snapped taut across their path, sending horses and riders tumbling. In the chaos that followed, her Winchester spoke 5 times in rapid succession, each shot finding its mark with competition-level precision. The would-be breachers fell back in disarray, leaving their charges scattered uselessly in the dirt. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" The Crow's voice carried a new note, something close to desperation beneath its controlled surface. "But you've made one crucial mistake, Sarah. You've forced me to take this personally." He raised a small silver whistle to his lips, its shrill call cutting through the night. In response, more riders appeared on the horizon, his reserve force held back for exactly this kind of situation. Sarah had expected reinforcements, but the number of approaching riders was concerning. Through her scope, she counted at least 15 more men, all well-armed and riding with military precision. The Crow's resources were clearly greater than anyone had suspected. This wasn't just a gang anymore. It was an army in the making. "Cooper!" she called out, shifting her position again. "Get the townspeople back. He's trying to surround us." The sheriff responded quickly, reorganizing their defenses to face the new threat. The arrival of the reinforcements had shifted the tactical situation dramatically, but Sarah's mind was already racing ahead, analyzing angles and opportunities just as she had during countless competitions. The Crow used the moment to press his advantage, directing his original force to push forward while the new arrivals moved to cut off any retreat. "Last chance, Mrs. MacKenzie," he announced, his voice carrying across the smoky battlefield. "Surrender now, and I'll let these good people return to their homes. Resist, and I'll burn every farm and ranch in the territory." Sarah's response came from an unexpected quarter. She had positioned herself in the house's upper window, where the angle allowed her to see something the Crow had missed. A familiar figure approaching from the direction of Helena. Thomas Mackenzie had returned, early from his business trip, and he wasn't alone. The flickering firelight revealed badges on the riders accompanying him, U.S. Marshals responding to Lucy's urgent message. The crow realized the change in situation a moment too late. His reinforcements were still moving into position when the marshals opened fire from behind, catching them in a devastating crossfire. The professional law officers' accuracy rivaled Sarah's own, their shots cutting through the gang's formation with deadly precision. But the crow hadn't survived the war and its aftermath by being easily trapped. With the speed and decision that had made him a feared cavalry officer, he gathered his remaining men for one desperate charge at the house. "Burn it down!" he roared, leading the attack himself. "Burn it all down!" The raiders surged forward, using the smoke from the wheat field as cover. Sarah's Winchester spoke again and again, each shot carefully placed to disable rather than kill when possible. She had learned long ago that killing should be a last resort, not a first choice, but the sheer number of attackers meant that some shots had to be lethal, a responsibility she accepted with the same steady nerves that had served her on the competition range. The night dissolved into chaos as multiple battles raged across the ranch. Thomas and the marshals engaged the reinforcements, their disciplined fire proving more than a match for the gang's superior numbers. Cooper and the townspeople held their line against the original raiders, while Sarah's deadly accuracy prevented any concentrated attack on the house from succeeding. Through her scope, Sarah kept track of the crow as he directed the assault. His movements were becoming more erratic, the careful tactical precision giving way to desperate fury as his plans unraveled. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for, when his military discipline would crack under the pressure of imminent defeat. "It's over, Colonel," she called out, her voice carrying that same professional calm that had unnerved his men earlier. "Your reinforcements are cut off, your men are surrounded, and the marshals have your name and history. End this before more blood is shed." Her words were calculated to remind him of his past, of the officer he had once been, before violence and ambition corrupted his sense of honor. The crow's response was a laugh that held no humor, only the kind of madness that comes from seeing carefully laid plans dissolve into ruin. "You think this ends here?" he shouted, spurring his horse toward the house. "I'll see this whole territory burn before I surrender to a woman." His charge was magnificent and suicidal, the kind of desperate bravery that had once made him a legendary cavalry officer. Sarah's next shot was perhaps her finest ever, a demonstration of skill that would have won any competition in the world. Her bullet struck the crow's gun hand with surgical precision, sending his weapon spinning away without taking his fingers. The shot was a deliberate choice, deadly accuracy used to disable rather than destroy, a final demonstration of the difference between justice and vengeance. The crow reeled in his saddle, clutching his injured hand, his facade of invincible. Leadership finally shattered. Around him, his men began throwing down their weapons, realizing that their leader's obsession had led them into a trap from which there was no escape. The night that had begun as a simple raid had become the end of the Blackhawk Gang's reign of terror. The surrender of the Blackhawk Gang didn't come easily. Even with their leader disarmed, pockets of resistance continued across the battlefield that Thunder Valley Ranch had become. The fires in the wheat field cast an apocalyptic glow over the scene, illuminating desperate men making their final stands. Sarah maintained her position at the upper window, her Winchester ensuring that no last-minute heroics would succeed in turning the tide. The crow sat his horse in the middle of the chaos, blood dripping from his injured hand, his expression a mask of fury and disbelief. 20 years of military service and 5 years of building his criminal empire, all undone by a woman he'd once competed against at a shooting tournament. The irony might have been amusing if it hadn't cost him everything he'd built. "You don't understand what you've done," he called out, his voice carrying a new edge of desperation. "I wasn't just building a gang. I was creating order. These territories need a strong hand to guide them. The war taught me that chaos can only be controlled through force." His words carried the conviction of a man who'd convinced himself that his crimes served a greater purpose. Sarah's response was measured, her rifle still trained on him. "I understand perfectly, Colonel. I understand that you brought the war home with you, that you never learned how to live in peace. But this territory doesn't need your kind of order." Through her scope, she could see Thomas and the marshals systematically disarming the remaining raiders, while Cooper organized the townspeople to contain the fires. The Crow's laugh was bitter. "Peace? I saw what peace meant after Appomattox. Weak men making weak decisions, letting everything we fought for slip away. Sometimes violence is the only language people understand." His uninjured hand strayed toward his boot, where Sarah knew he kept a derringer. She'd noticed it during their competition days, his habit of always having a backup plan. "Don't," she warned, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "You're better than that, James. Or at least, you used to be." Her use of his first name caused him to freeze, memories of a different life flickering across his face. "I remember how you spoke about honor at that tournament in St. Louis. What happened to that man?" The question seemed to hit him harder than her bullet had. For a moment, the hardened gang leader disappeared, replaced by the shadow of the cavalry officer he'd once been. "He died at Gettysburg," the Crow replied quietly. "Watching good men die for nothing has a way of changing your perspective on honor." Lucy Chen approached cautiously, carrying a medical bag. "Let me look at that hand," she offered, her voice steady despite her fear. The Crow glanced at her, then at Sarah, before slowly extending his injured hand. As Lucy worked, more details of the battle's aftermath became clear. 3 townspeople had been wounded, none seriously. The Blackhawk Gang had lost 6 men, with another dozen injured to varying degrees. Thomas MacKenzie rode up to the house, his face lined with concern and pride. "Sarah," he called out, "the marshals need your statement. They're particularly interested in hearing about the Colonel's activities back east." His words caused the Crow's head to snap up, his eyes narrowing as he realized the full extent of his exposure. "You knew," he said to Sarah, comprehension dawning. "That's why you were so prepared. You weren't just defending your farm, you were setting a trap." The admiration in his voice was genuine, despite everything. "How long have you known who I was?" Sarah finally descended from her position, emerging onto the porch with her Winchester still ready. "Since the first reports of the Blackhawk Gang's tactics reached us, military precision, professional equipment, a leader who wore crow feathers. It wasn't hard to connect the dots to the rumors about a cavalry officer who'd gone rogue after the war. The St. Louis tournament just confirmed it." The marshals approached, led by a gruff man named Davidson, who'd clearly seen his share of action. "Colonel James Blackwood," he announced formally, "you're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, robbery, and territorial violations. We've been tracking you since that bank job in Missouri." He turned to Sarah with respect. "Mrs. McKenzie's message about your location was the break we needed." The Crow's expression hardened again. "So all this, the defense, the townspeople, the preparation, it was all just an elaborate scheme to capture me." His voice carried both anger and reluctant respect. "You played me like a master strategist." "No," Sarah replied firmly. "Defending my home and this community was always the primary goal. Bringing you to justice was just an added benefit." She surveyed the battlefield that had been her farm, noting the damage that would need to be repaired. "We had to show everyone that standing up to terror is possible, that one person's strength can inspire others to find their own." Cooper approached, his badge gleaming in the firelight. "The fires are under control," he reported, "and we found something interesting in the gang's saddlebags, documents linking them to corrupt officials in 3 territories. The Crow wasn't just building a gang, he was creating a network of influence." The implications of this discovery rippled through the gathered crowd. The Blackhawk Gang's activities had been part of a larger scheme to control the territory through a combination of violence and political manipulation. Sarah's stand hadn't just stopped a raid. It had disrupted a carefully planned campaign of corruption. As the marshals began organizing the prisoners for transport, Thomas made his way to Sarah's side. "When I got Lucy's message in Helena, I feared I'd return to find the worst," he admitted, his arms slipping around her waist. "I should have known better. You never lost a competition when it really mattered." The Crow watched this exchange with an unreadable expression. "You know this isn't over," he called out as the marshals prepared to take him away. "There will always be others like me, men who understand that civilization is built on controlled violence. You've won today, but tomorrow—" He left the threat, hanging. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "And there will always be people willing to stand against them," she replied. "That's what you never understood, Colonel. True strength isn't about having the most guns or the most men. It's about having something worth fighting for and the courage to defend it." Dawn was breaking over Thunder Valley Ranch, the first rays of sun cutting through the smoke from the dying fires. The night's events had transformed more than just the landscape. The territory's people had discovered their own courage, inspired by one woman's refusal to submit to terror. The legend of the rancher's wife, who outshot the notorious Blackhawk Gang, would spread, but the true victory lay in the community's discovery of its own strength. Lucy finished bandaging the last of the wounded, while Jenny organized teams to assess and repair the damage. The wheat field would need replanting, the barn required repairs, but these were small prices to pay for freedom from fear. The territory would recover, stronger for having faced and overcome its challenges. As the marshals rode away with their prisoners, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion of the night's events. Her competition days had taught her the importance of maintaining focus until the very end, but now she could relax her vigilance. The Winchester that had served her so well returned to its place above the fireplace, though she suspected it wouldn't rest there as long as it had before. The territory had changed, and she had helped change it. The quiet rancher's wife, who had hidden her trophies behind paintings, had shown that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most effective resistance comes from unexpected sources. As the sun rose fully over Thunder Valley Ranch, it illuminated not just a battlefield, but the dawning of a new era in the territory's history. In the days following the battle at Thunder Valley Ranch, the territory underwent a transformation as profound as the changing autumn leaves. News of Sarah MacKenzie's stand against the Blackhawk Gang spread rapidly, carried by riders and telegraph operators who understood they were passing along more than just information. They were spreading hope. The story grew with each telling, though the truth needed no embellishment to inspire. The damage to Thunder Valley Ranch told its own story. Scorched earth in the wheat field traced the path of the Crow's failed tactics, while bullet holes in the barn and house stood as testament to the ferocity of the fight. Yet, even as they worked to repair the physical damage, Sarah noticed a deeper change in the people around her. The fear that had haunted their eyes for so long had been replaced by something stronger: determination. Lucy Chen and Jenny Miller had organized a rotation of volunteers to help with repairs, their natural leadership abilities emerging in the wake of the crisis. "It's not just about fixing your farm," Lucy explained as she directed a team replacing damaged fence posts. "It's about showing everyone that we can rebuild anything they destroy." Her words carried the weight of someone who had discovered her own courage in the heat of battle. Sheriff Cooper had undergone perhaps the most striking transformation. The tremor in his hands had disappeared completely, replaced by the steady grip that had once made him famous. He'd poured out every bottle of whiskey in his office, replacing them with wanted posters and telegraph reports about other gangs operating in the territory. The Crow was right about one thing, he told Sarah during one of his daily patrols. There will be others, but now we know how to handle them. Thomas MacKenzie watched his wife with a mixture of pride and amazement as she moved. Between work crews, her competition-honed eye for detail, ensuring that every repair met her exacting standards. You know, he said during a quiet moment, when I first saw you shoot in that tournament in Denver, I knew you were remarkable, but I never imagined you'd end up defending our home like a military strategist. Sarah smiled, running her hand along her Winchester's worn stock. All those years of competition taught me more than just accuracy, she replied. They taught me how to read people, how to predict their movements. The Crow's mistake was thinking that military training was the only path to tactical thinking. The marshals had remained in the territory for several days after the battle, gathering evidence and taking statements. The documents found in the gang's possession had proven even more significant than initially suspected. The Crow's network of corruption extended into state governments and territorial offices, a web of influence that had protected his operations while he built his criminal empire. The ripples from this will spread far, Marshal Davidson had told Sarah before departing with his prisoners. You didn't just stop a gang, you helped expose a conspiracy that threatens the very foundation of law in these territories. He'd paused, studying her with professional appreciation. We could use someone with your skills in the marshal's service. Sarah had declined politely, but firmly. My place is here, she'd said, gesturing to the ranch and the community surrounding it. Sometimes the best way to fight corruption is to show people they can stand against it right where they are. The Crow's interrogation had revealed the full scope of his ambitions. He'd been systematically taking control of key transportation, routes and water rights, using violence to force sales, while his corrupt officials legitimized the transactions. Thunder Valley Ranch had been more than just another target. Its strategic location and water access would have given him control over the entire valley's agricultural output. Word of the battle's outcome had spread throughout the territories, carried by telegraph operators who recognized the significance of what had happened. Other communities, facing their own struggles with outlaws and corruption, sent riders to learn from Sarah's example. The legend grew, but the reality was more meaningful. One person's courage had reminded an entire territory of its own strength. Martha Peterson and her son Michael had returned to their burned farm with new determination. The community rallied around them, helping to rebuild what the Blackhawk Gang had destroyed. Sarah often rode out to assist, teaching Martha the basics of defensive shooting while they worked. Not everyone needs to be a competition marksman, she explained, helping the older woman sight down a rifle barrel. But everyone needs to know they can defend what's theirs. The captured gang members, facing territorial justice, began turning on each other, revealing more details about the Crow's operation. The web of corruption began to unravel as compromised officials resigned or fled, replaced by men and women determined to restore honest governance to the territory. The change wasn't instantaneous, but it was profound, like watching winter give way to spring, slow but inevitable. Lucy Chen's father, inspired by the events, had begun organizing regular shooting practice sessions for the townspeople. My ancestors were warriors, he explained to Sarah when asking for her guidance. Sometimes we forget that protecting our community is part of our heritage. Sarah helped design a training program that emphasized accuracy and discipline over mere firepower, teaching the same principles that had served her so well in competition. Sheriff Cooper, restored to his former confidence, implemented new policies for mutual defense between isolated farms. Regular patrols and a system of signal fires ensured that no homestead would ever face raiders alone again. The Crow's biggest mistake, he observed during a strategy meeting, was thinking that fear was stronger than community. You proved him wrong, Sarah. The documents recovered from the gang had led to investigations across 3 territories. Marshal Davidson sent regular updates as the case expanded, revealing a pattern of corruption that had enabled not just the Blackhawk Gang, but numerous other criminal operations. The territories were changing, growing stronger as they confronted the cancer that had been growing within their institutions. Thomas found Sarah one evening on their porch, watching the sunset. "Paint the repaired barn in shades of gold. Do you ever regret giving up competition shooting?" he asked, knowing how many trophies she'd won before choosing a quieter life. Her answer surprised him. "I never gave it up," she replied, her eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. "I just found a more important target." She touched the Winchester. That was never far from reach these days. Competition taught me discipline, focus, and precision. That night proved those skills matter more than ever. The territory's transformation continued, subtle but undeniable. Where isolated homesteads had once huddled in fear, communities now stood united. Sarah's example had shown them that resistance wasn't futile, that one person's courage could inspire others to find their own strength. The night of the battle had become a turning point, marking the moment when fear gave way to determination. As autumn deepened toward winter, Thunder Valley Ranch stood restored, its buildings repaired and fields replanted, but the most significant changes weren't physical. The territory had discovered its own strength, inspired by a woman who had turned competition shooting skills into a shield against tyranny. Sarah's stand had become more than just a single night's victory. It was a reminder that courage, like marksmanship, improves with practice and determination. The Winchester above the fireplace no longer hid behind a painting. Sarah's trophies and medals hung beside it openly now, not as boasts but as reminders that expertise born of dedication can serve purposes far beyond competition. The territory was changing, growing stronger with each passing day, and Thunder Valley Ranch stood as a symbol of that transformation. A place where one woman's skill and courage had shown an entire community how to stand against fear itself. Winter descended on Thunder Valley Ranch with unexpected gentleness, soft snow covering the last visible scars of the battle that had transformed the territory. Sarah MacKenzie stood at her familiar post on the porch, but her morning coffee routine now included checking the network of signal mirrors installed on distant ridges, a new warning system that connected the valley's scattered homesteads. The key? Morning sun caught the mirror's surfaces, each flash confirming that another farm had made it safely through the night. The capture of the Blackhawk Gang had created a vacuum in the territory, and nature, as Sarah well knew from her years of farming, abhors a vacuum. Marshal Davidson's weekly telegrams brought news of smaller gangs testing the boundaries, probing for weakness in the wake of the Crow's fall. But they found something different from what they expected. A network of communities prepared to defend themselves. 3 riders approached the Wilson place yesterday, Sheriff Cooper reported during his regular patrol. The tremor in his hands was long gone, replaced by the steady confidence that had made him a legend before the dark days. They took one look at Mrs. Wilson practicing with her rifle and rode on. He smiled, remembering how Sarah's shooting lessons had transformed the timid widow into someone who could defend her own property. Sarah had initially resisted requests to teach others, believing her competition experience was too specialized to be useful. But Lucy Chen had convinced her otherwise. "You didn't just outshoot the Blackhawk Gang," Lucy had argued. "You outsmarted them. That's what people need to learn, how to think like defenders instead of victims." The shooting school they'd established in an old barn outside town had quickly become more than just a place to practice marksmanship. Women who had never held a rifle before found confidence they didn't know they possessed. Men learned that accuracy mattered more than speed, that discipline trumped bravado, but most importantly, people learned to work together, to coordinate their defenses just as Sarah had coordinated the town's response on that crucial night. Thomas MacKenzie watched these changes with quiet pride, supporting his wife's expanding role in the community while managing their growing ranch operations. The winter wheat was coming in strong, untouched by the fire damage that had threatened their livelihood. "You've started something bigger than just defense lessons," he observed one evening as Sarah cleaned her Winchester. "You're teaching people to think differently about themselves." The truth of his words was evident in how the territory had changed. Farms that had once stood isolated now cooperated regularly, sharing resources and information. Lucy Chen's father had organized a network of riders who carried news between communities, ensuring that no threat went unnoticed. Jenny Miller had transformed her father's saloon into a community gathering place where strategies were discussed and alliances formed, but success brought its own challenges. Word of the territory's transformation had spread, attracting both honest settlers and those who saw opportunity in change. Sarah found herself increasingly called upon to judge character as well as teach marksmanship, to distinguish between those who wanted to contribute to the community and those who might threaten it. "It's like reading a target," she explained to Cooper during one such assessment. "You look for patterns, for signs that tell you what you're really dealing with." Her competition experience had taught her to notice details others missed, to see the subtle indicators of intention and capability. The territorial governor himself had taken notice of the changes. His letter, delivered by special courier, praised the community's initiative while subtly suggesting that such local organization might be seen as challenging official authority. Sarah's response, crafted with the same precision she brought to her shooting, had been clear. They were strengthening the territory's legitimate governance, not replacing it. "But that's not how everyone sees it," Marshal Davidson warned during an unexpected visit. The Crow had allies in high places, people who profited from the chaos he created. They're not happy about communities learning to defend themselves. His words carried the weight of wider concerns, of politics beyond the valley's boundaries. Sarah absorbed this information with the same calm focus she'd once brought to competition. Then they should understand what that night at Thunder Valley ranch really meant, she replied. It wasn't just about stopping one gang. It was about people deciding they deserved better than living in fear. The shooting school had expanded to include tactical thinking and community defense strategies. Sarah found herself teaching concepts she'd developed during years of competition: how to read terrain, predict movement, and coordinate with others. In competition, you're alone on the range, she explained to her students. But out here, survival depends on working together. Lucy Chen had proven an exceptional student, her natural intelligence complementing Sarah's experience. Together, they developed training methods that adapted competition shooting principles to practical defense. It's like that Chinese game my grandfather taught me, Lucy observed. Wei Qi, where victory comes from controlling space rather than just defeating opponents. The winter months brought new challenges. Heavy snow, isolated homesteads, testing the communication networks they'd established. But the same conditions that made travel difficult also made it easier to spot potential threats. Sarah's students learned to read tracks in snow, to distinguish between innocent travelers and those with darker intentions. Martha Peterson's rebuilt farm became a testament to the community's new strength. Where the Blackhawk Gang had once burned buildings to create fear, neighbors had raised new ones as a sign of defiance. Martha herself had transformed from a victim into one of Sarah's most dedicated students, her quiet determination inspiring others who remembered losing everything to raiders. The real victory Sarah told Thomas, as they watched new settlers arriving in the valley, isn't in how many people we've taught to shoot. It's in how many we've taught to stand together. The territory's transformation had proven that strength came in many forms, that a community's united resistance could be more powerful than any gang's violence. Cooper's office had become a hub of information, with maps tracking both threats and resources across the territory. The sheriff had reorganized his deputies, implementing lessons learned from the battle at Thunder Valley Ranch. Every ranch is a potential fortress, he explained to new settlers. Every community a source of strength. That's what Sarah taught us. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people carried themselves. The fear that had once haunted their eyes had been replaced by quiet confidence. They walked taller, spoke more freely, knowing they were part of something stronger than individual courage. Sarah's stand against the Blackhawk Gang had shown them what was possible, but their own determination had made it real. As winter deepened, Thunder Valley Ranch stood as a symbol of this transformation. The repaired buildings and replanted fields demonstrated resilience, while the regular sound of target practice from the shooting school promised continued vigilance. Sarah's trophies, now displayed proudly alongside tools for community defense, reminded everyone that expertise could serve a greater purpose than personal glory. The territory was changing, growing into something stronger than mere law could create. It was becoming a place where people looked out for each other, where defense meant more than just guns and guards. Sarah's legacy wasn't just in the accuracy she taught or the tactics she shared. It was in showing that true security came from communities deciding to stand together against whatever threats might come. Spring came early to Thunder Valley Ranch, the melting snow revealing both new growth and old scars. Sarah MacKenzie stood at her usual morning post, but her attention was focused on a cloud of dust approaching from the eastern ridge. Through her spyglass, she could make out a group of riders moving with the kind of purpose that demanded attention. Their approach was too organized to be ordinary travelers, too direct to be casual visitors. Thomas, she called to her husband, who was checking the new irrigation systems they'd installed over the winter. "We've got company coming." Her voice carried no alarm, just the calm assessment that had served her so well during her competition days. Years of reading targets had taught her to notice patterns, and these riders were displaying a pattern she recognized: military precision disguised as casual movement. Lucy Chen arrived moments later, her horse lathered from hard riding. "They're asking questions in town," she reported, dismounting smoothly with the new confidence she'd developed over the winter. "3 men came through yesterday, wanting to know about the Blackhawk Gang's old territories. They're carrying papers from the territorial capital, but something feels wrong about them." Sarah nodded, understanding Lucy's concern. The Crows' capture had exposed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Marshal Davidson's latest telegram had warned that some of those corrupted officials were trying to maintain their influence, using legal documents to mask illegal intentions. "Get word to Cooper," Sarah instructed, "and signal the EU outlying farms. If these men are what I think they are, they'll want to see how we respond to their presence." Her hands moved automatically to check her Winchester, the weapon as much a part of her now as it had been during her competition days. The shooting school had evolved over the winter months, becoming more than just a place to practice marksmanship. Sarah had taught her students to read situations as well as targets, to understand that defense began long before the first shot was fired. Now that training was about to be tested in ways none of them had expected, Sheriff Cooper arrived within the hour, his deputy positioned strategically on the ridge overlooking the approach to Thunder Valley Ranch. "They're carrying territorial marshal badges," he reported, "but Davidson's office hasn't authorized any new marshals in this region." Something's not right. The riders approached with calculated casualness, their leader a tall man whose expensive clothes couldn't quite hide his military bearing. "Mrs. Mackenzie," he called out, reining his horse to a stop at a carefully chosen distance. "I'm Special Marshal James Harrison. We're investigating claims of vigilante activity in this territory." Sarah studied him with the same focus she'd once used to evaluate competition targets. His badge was genuine, but his story didn't match the subtle signs she'd learned to read. The way his men positioned themselves, the careful attention to lines of sight. These weren't law officers concerned about vigilantes. This was a tactical deployment disguised as official business. Interesting timing, she replied, her voice carrying easily across the yard. Marshal Davidson didn't mention any investigation during his visit last week. The slight tension in Harrison's shoulders confirmed her suspicion. He hadn't known about Davidson's regular contact with the community. "The investigation is recent," Harrison answered smoothly. "We've had reports of citizens taking the law into their own hands, organizing armed groups without proper authority. The territorial governor is concerned." His emphasis on the last word carried a subtle threat, one that would have worked better in the days before the community had found its strength. Thomas stepped forward, his presence a reminder that Thunder Valley Ranch had become more than just a farm. It was a symbol of the territory's transformation. "Seems to me," he said carefully, "that citizens defending their homes against outlaws is about as proper as authority gets." Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The law requires proper supervision of armed groups, Mrs. Mackenzie. You're shooting. School, for instance, operating without official oversight, training people in military tactics. Some might see that as preparing for insurrection." Sarah recognized the strategy, the same kind of bureaucratic pressure the Crow had used to legitimize his takeover of other territories. But this community had learned to recognize threats in all their forms. "My students learn marksmanship and self-defense," she corrected him, "the same skills I used to win shooting competitions. Unless the territorial government now considers sports training a threat." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of more riders, farmers and townspeople who had seen the signals and understood their meaning. Jenny Miller, Lucy Chen, Martha Peterson, faces that had become synonymous with the territory's strength. They took up positions casually but effectively, demonstrating without words that this community stood together. Harrison's men shifted uneasily, recognizing that their carefully planned intimidation had encountered something unexpected. These weren't frightened homesteaders who could be cowed by badges and official papers. This was an organized community that had learned to read threats and respond to them. "We're not here to cause trouble," Harrison offered, his tone shifting to something more conciliatory. "The governor simply wants to ensure proper oversight of community defense activities. Perhaps we could discuss some form of official recognition for your training program." Sarah heard the real offer hidden in his words. Compromise that would put their defense network under control of the same corrupt system that had protected the Blackhawk Gang. Her response was measured, each word chosen as carefully as she'd once selected competition ammunition. "Our community has learned something important," she said, her voice carrying to everyone present. "Defense isn't just about guns and guards. It's about people standing together, watching out for each other. That's not something that needs official oversight. It's something that needs official protection." Cooper moved to stand beside her, his badge catching the morning sun. "The law exists to serve the community, Special Marshal, not the other way around. Any oversight needs to come from the people being protected, not from officers hundreds of miles away." Harrison's facade cracked slightly, revealing the frustration beneath. "The territorial government won't look kindly on armed resistance to its authority, Mrs. Mackenzie. Even heroes can be charged with insurrection." The threat was open now, but it fell on ears that had learned to distinguish between true authority and its corruption. "No one here is resisting legitimate authority," Sarah replied calmly. "We're defending our homes and our neighbors, just as the law allows. If the territorial government wants to help with that defense, we welcome their support. If they want to control it for other purposes..." She let the implications hang in the air. The standoff stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. But Sarah had learned long ago that patience was as important as accuracy. Harrison's men were professionals. They could read the situation as well as she could. What had seemed like an easy intimidation mission had turned into something far more complicated. Finally, Harrison reined his horse around. "This isn't over, Mrs. MacKenzie. The governor will hear about this." His men followed his lead, their departure as precisely organized as their arrival had been. But they left behind something important, the knowledge that badges and papers weren't enough to cow a community that had found its strength. As the dust from their departure settled, Sarah turned to the gathered community members. "They'll be back," she said simply, "with different tactics, different papers, different threats. But they'll find the same thing waiting for them. People who have learned to stand together." The territory was changing in ways the corrupt officials in the capital couldn't understand. It wasn't just about armed resistance or organized defense. It was about communities discovering that their greatest strength lay in supporting each other, in refusing to be intimidated by any threat, whether it came wearing a gang's colors or carrying official papers. Thunder Valley Ranch had become more than just a symbol of resistance against outlaws. It was now a reminder that true authority came from the community itself, from people deciding to stand together against any force that threatened their right to live in peace. The battle against the Blackhawk Gang had taught them how to fight. The months since had taught them why the fight mattered. 1 year after the battle at Thunder Valley Ranch, Sarah MacKenzie stood on her porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold. The wheat fields had recovered completely, showing no signs of the fire that had nearly destroyed them. But the territory's transformation went far deeper than restored crops and repaired buildings. The shooting school had become an official training center, but not in the way Special Marshal Harrison had intended. After his confrontation with the community, the territorial governor had faced a choice: acknowledge the legitimate right of citizens to defend themselves, or face growing resistance to corrupt authority. The arrival of federal investigators, armed with evidence gathered from the Blackhawk Gang's documents, had helped him make the right decision. Marshal Davidson brought the news himself, riding in one spring morning with official papers that recognized the community's right to organize its own defense. "The territory is changing," he told Sarah as they reviewed the documents. "What happened here showed everyone that corruption only thrives when people are too afraid to stand together." The Crow's trial had revealed the full scope of his operation, leading to the arrest of 12 corrupt officials and the resignation of many others. But more importantly, it had exposed the systematic way that criminals had used fear and official corruption to control entire territories. Sarah's stand hadn't just stopped one gang, it had helped break a pattern that had plagued the frontier for decades. Lucy Chen had taken charge of coordinating the territory's new communication network, combining her father's trading connections with modern telegraph systems. "Information moves faster than bullets," she liked to say, quoting one of Sarah's favorite lessons. Under her management, news of potential threats reached communities in time for them to prepare, while success stories inspired others to organize their own defenses. Sheriff Cooper's office had become a model for other law enforcement agencies, demonstrating how official authority could work with community defense networks instead of trying to control them. His deputies now trained regularly at Sarah's shooting school, learning that accuracy and judgment mattered more than speed and force. "You've built something remarkable," Thomas told his wife as they watched new students practicing at the range. They'd constructed behind the old barn. Not just a shooting school or a defense network. You've shown people that they don't have to choose between law and protection. Sarah's reputation had grown beyond the territory's borders. Other communities sent representatives to learn from her experience, but they discovered that her most important lessons weren't about marksmanship. The gun is just a tool, she would tell them. The real weapon is the confidence to stand together against those who would rule through fear. The territorial governor himself came to visit Thunder Valley Ranch, hoping to understand how one community's resistance had sparked such widespread change. He found Sarah teaching a class of new settlers, her Winchester serving as a pointer. As she explained the principles of community defense, Mrs. MacKenzie, he acknowledged, watching as students practice the deliberate movements she'd learned in competition. I owe you an apology. When I first heard about your shooting school, I thought it was a threat to proper authority. Now I understand that it's helping restore people's faith in legitimate governance. Sarah studied him with the same careful attention she'd once given competition targets. Fear and corruption feed each other, she replied. Break one, and the other becomes harder to maintain. The Blackhawk Gang taught us that violence only works when people believe they're alone in resisting it. The governor nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's why Harrison's intimidation tactics failed. He was using methods that only work on isolated individuals, not united communities. His gaze swept over the transformed valley. How do we ensure this continues? That other territories learn from your example? Sarah's answer came from years of competition experience, the same way you improve at any skill: practice, persistence, and passing on what you've learned. Communities have to maintain their strength the same way marksmen maintain their accuracy. Thunder Valley Ranch had become more than just a symbol of resistance. It was now a center for learning, where people discovered that defending their homes meant more than just learning to shoot. The principles Sarah had learned in competition, focus, discipline, cooperation, were being applied to community organization and mutual defense. Martha Peterson's son Michael had grown into one of Sarah's best students, combining his mother's determination with the tactical awareness he'd developed during that crucial night. The Blackhawk Gang thought they could control us through fear, he told new settlers. Instead, they taught us how to be stronger than our fears. The territory's transformation had attracted attention from Washington. A congressional committee studying frontier law enforcement visited Thunder Valley Ranch, seeking to understand how one community's stand against corruption had sparked such widespread change. They found something more complex than simply armed resistance. They discovered a model for how communities could defend themselves while strengthening legitimate authority. The key, Sarah explained to the committee, is understanding that true security comes from people working together, not just having weapons or guards. Competition taught me that excellence requires both individual skill and community support. The same principle applies to defending our homes. The shooting school's success had inspired similar programs across the frontier, but Sarah made sure they understood the most important lesson. It's not about creating vigilantes or private armies. It's about building communities strong enough to resist those who would control them through violence or corruption. Lucy Chen had organized a network of similar schools, each adapted to local needs, but all following the core principles Sarah had developed. We're not just teaching people to shoot, she explained. We're teaching them to believe in their own strength and in each other. As sunset painted Thunder Valley Ranch in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah stood at her familiar post on the porch, her Winchester close at hand, but no longer needed for constant vigilance. The territory had changed, growing into something stronger than she had imagined possible that night when she'd faced down the Blackhawk Gang. Some battles, she told her, students, are won with bullets, but the most important victories come from people deciding to stand together against fear itself. The shooting trophies that had once hidden behind paintings now hung proudly beside photographs of community defense classes, each representing a different kind of victory. The legacy of Thunder Valley Ranch wasn't just in the skills Sarah had taught or the defense network she'd helped create. It was in showing that ordinary people, standing together, could be stronger than any force that tried to control them through fear or corruption. The territory had learned that true security came not from weapons or walls, but from communities united in defending their right to live in peace. As night settled over the valley, signal fires winked from distant ridges. Not warnings now, but reminders of how far they'd come and what they'd achieved together. Sarah MacKenzie, former competition shooter turned community defender, watched those lights with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the most important target she'd ever hit wasn't on any competition range. It was the moment she'd shown an entire territory that courage, like accuracy, improves with practice and determination. The story of the rancher's wife who outshot the Blackhawk Gang had become legend, but the truth was more powerful than any legend. It was the story of how one person's stand against fear had helped transform a territory, reminding everyone that the strongest defense against tyranny is a community that refuses to be afraid.